Helen, our listeners to this podcast may remember that last year I had an incident, August bank holiday, where I got sunburn on my legs and then managed to spill AdBlue down myself and give myself a nice little kind of sunburn chemical burn, which was just not the most brightest thing in the world. So when the weather's been warm recently, went to Rutland Water in Rutland, obviously, and I remembered, so I put suntan lotion on, so I didn't get burnt. So I think I've improved my sunburn consciousness.
It definitely can be really tricky. I think we're going to need an unbelievable amount of activity in our house this year for the way we've started.
Hi, I'm David Julian. When it comes to agronomics, I am a rock. And ever present for what's now 44 whole episodes. Let's just say without me, it would be the sound of science, which many of you may prefer. The focus of this podcast is to look at the economics of agriculture. And this time, we're looking at the annual Planting and Variety Survey, which opened earlier this week, meaning we have truly said goodbye to a hazy shade of winter and are future gazing with this year's harvest in mind. I'm joined by my aptly named colleague Helen Plant to understand how UK growers can get involved with the survey. In fact, we will stress the need for as many of them to get involved to help offer early estimates of crop areas. We'll also be discussing crop conditions after the recent, some would say fabulous, some would say not fabulous, warm and dry weather that we've been having, and more besides. Whether you're old friends or new to the show, please follow and subscribe wherever you stream your podcasts to make sure you don't miss an episode. New shows drop at midday on Wednesdays, and please get in touch. Comment on any of AHDB's social channels or send us an email, agronomics@ahdb.org.uk. So we're going to talk about the weather, and we're talking about crop areas and crop conditions in this podcast. But the one thing that we can't really ignore, a storm, if you like, using a weather pun, that has been going around global markets, has been the impact of the recently announced US tariffs. And this is one of those things when you're recording a podcast, because for those of you who have listened to this podcast before, you may be surprised to know, even though this podcast goes out at midday on a Wednesday, this isn't being recorded at midday on a Wednesday. Oh no, we have recorded this hours in advance. And the market does like to make a fool of yourself. So I'm not going to say anything too specific, because if I say that the market has completely died on its backside, there will be an obvious bounce and the market will be going up when this gets published. So not talking about specifics, let's just talk about the overall purpose and aim and the impact that it could have on domestic agriculture. And it's interesting from a Trumpian economics perspective that trade is something that's viewed as extremely protectionist. The impact of these tariffs is entirely to support the domestic US economy, but it's the sort of the knock-on impact of these tariffs that's the issue. But let's look at agriculture for a time, talk about some stats around that. So the main agricultural exports to the US, Canada, Mexico, EU, Australia, New Zealand. The US actually imported £7 billion sterling worth of beef, over £1 billion worth of pork, £1 billion worth of sheep meat, and almost £1.5 billion of cheese, sort of between 22 and 24 on a 3-year average. So there is significant market scales there. And the main exporters of beef going into the US would be Canada, Mexico, Australia, New Zealand. And from the UK perspective, there is volume, but compared to the billion-dollar markets of Canada, Mexico, and Australia, we're nowhere near that level. Main exporters of pork, Canada, significant volumes from Canada, almost 3 times that as the next trading bloc from the EU, and significantly more than Mexico as the third largest. But the UK comes into it from a cheese perspective that we see from a European perspective. They sell about £1 billion worth of cheese to the US on average. UK is about £70 million worth of cheese. Canada's about 60 million. So it's a significant market. And obviously that's going to be something that we're going to see potential disruption. I suppose that immediate impact too on the domestic market. It's whether the processors and sales from this side of the pond want to absorb any of those tariffs or put it straight into the cost, or even focus on alternative markets. So from a UK perspective, I'm looking at the other markets. We only export about £2.9 million worth of fresh and frozen beef. and about £23 million worth of pork. But again, still significant volumes. I suppose the thing with the tariffs is the immediate impact is evident. It's just 10% whack on all prices. It's the knock-on effects of that, of how trade flows change, that I think is going to be the interesting thing to monitor as we go forwards. That if people view the US and go, well, it's too expensive to move there, I'm going to try and move my product elsewhere, you can create these structural shifts in global trading patterns, which starts to impact the price in an even greater way because you have oversupply in other areas and people being more competitive. And so whilst you see the immediate 10% impact from the US perspective, it's actually the other impacts of those changes in trading structures and trade channels around the world that is going to be the thing we're going to have to monitor. And it isn't obviously the thing that's sort of direct of one-to-one that impacts us. It can be one change from another country, but because that has a knock-on effect of how they then trade, eventually it all filters through because of that hyper-connected, globalized market we're part of. So whichever way you look at it, it is a disruptive impact for all sectors and all industries, and it's going to take quite a bit of time, I think, for trade patterns to settle down, and there may be new trade deals that are agreed which change it as well. So it means that it is something we're going to be talking about for a long, long time, the disruption that this causes. And speaking of disruption, if we look at the weather that we've had recently, I think for the majority of people in the country, they'll be more than happy that we've had a beautiful start to spring with mild days. Still a bit cold overnight, so soil temperatures struggle to kind of get really high, but it is starting to promote growth and it's pulling crop development forwards. So we thought, before we start talking about the planting and variety survey and what that is and what we're doing this year, that we'll talk about crop conditions to start with. And as I said, I'm joined by my colleague Helen Plant, and we've been looking at crop conditions, haven't we, Helen? Because there's been a report that was released recently, which was very aptly timed, that was looking at crop conditions at the end of March, wasn't it?
So yeah, at the end of March, we had a report in from some external contractors for us. What they do is they go across the country, they pull together insights on how the crops are looking, what stages they're up to, generally any sort of main watch points or areas of concern. And then we put it together and put it out. So then sort of thinking about what that was showing, it was pulling out that actually compared to winter, for winter cereals, things were definitely improved, which was in contrast to 12 months ago where things were very, very challenging indeed. So just using wheat as an example, at the end of March, we were looking at about 67% of wheat being rated as in a good or excellent condition across the country. That was up from 44% at the end of November. So quite a notable improvement. Particularly then when we look compared to 12 months ago, it was just a third. So a much, much better condition than we've had recently. So the important thing to note is we're not quite at the levels we've seen in recent years, when we've sort of been looking at those 80, 90% rated good to excellent at this stage, but still much, much better than recent times anyway.
We've seen variation in end crop size because of planting window weather over recent years, because we had that sort of 2019 into 2020 autumn winter that was really poor, and then obviously last year we saw the same. You know, we've seen periods where we've had dryness that's affected crops, but I suppose in terms of that variability in weather patterns, we are seeing, you know, drier springs earlier in season. And actually the weather as it currently is reminds me of COVID lockdowns, because if we cast our mind back 5 years to the first COVID lockdown, we had a very similar spring where I don't think people were particularly bothered to be told to sit in their houses when we had a really lovely, beautiful weather. That's me massively flippantly oversimplifying a global pandemic there just because the sun was out. So it's interesting, I think, to see that due to that, what must only be really from a climate change perspective, we're seeing a different pattern of growth and a different pattern of sort of development with crops year on year. So I suppose my question, Helen, is how do these figures from where we are now kind of translate to end yield figures? You know, is there a close correlation between the two?
I'm going to get my caveats in here first and say that we've only been running the crop condition scores for about, I think it's 6 years now. So from a purely statistical point of view, that's not a lot of data points, and just take with caution. But there is actually quite a strong relationship between the sort of condition scores as they stand in late March and then final yields, particularly for wheat. It loosens up a little bit for some of the other crops, but I think when you're looking at the most widely grown cereal across the UK, we do have a strong relationship coming through. And that's giving us confidence that the scores we're seeing at the moment would link to probably close to sort of average yield levels. I mean, the 5-year average for the past 5 years is a little bit lower than some of the ones we've seen in recent times. If we go back 10, 15 years, just because we're including two more challenging years within that average. But it's still encouraging. It does point to that sort of average level at the moment. And that's probably across the winter cereals as well, giving us that bit of confidence there.
And obviously, we can only talk about winter crops at this stage because the spring crops have only just started going in the ground. And that's going to be the more challenging thing, isn't it, of going into a dry seed bed, because it allows everyone the ability to get on the land and get the seeds in, but realistically for them to develop and start coming through and showing some good early growth and early vigor, we are going to need some rain soon. But spring wheat is such a small proportion of the crop, it's less of an impact. That's more from a spring barley perspective that I think we're kind of concerned on that side, isn't it?
Yeah, spring barley would absolutely be the main one. A little bit less, but spring oats as well, though that tends to be a little later planted as well. So we'll just have to watch how the forecast goes. Like you said earlier, we're not going to talk too closely about markets. I wouldn't talk too closely about weather either, just because of the way forecasts can change. But at the moment, there doesn't seem to be too much in the imminent forecast. So our contractors were saying that at the end of March, most sort of soils for winter crops were staying relatively moist, at least a little bit further down, close enough to where we needed them to be. It does just raise that question, like you say, for spring crops. It is a bit of something we'll just need to keep an eye on.
It's easy for me to say this as I don't physically own a crop that's planted in the ground, but it's still early. And I think, again, it's really early in the year. I was talking, again, to my wife and friends over the weekend recently, and we were saying that it seems as if it kind of feels as if it's, full spring, let's all move into summer, but we haven't even had Easter yet. So it is still early in the crop development, and we move into that critical phase now of that crop development as things start to develop. But obviously, we're just having a very early warm spring, and I think the risk is now obviously from a winter crop perspective, trying to kind of hold things back. The benefit of it is from a disease perspective, evidently it isn't really mild with lots of rain. That helps to kind of bring on disease pressures. We're keeping it at a dry level, but it is still a bit of a risk. One question I had for you, Helen, on a different winter crop was around winter oilseed rape and just sort of what the conditions are there, because obviously we talk about cabbage stem flea beetle a lot, and we've spoken about the decline in the oilseed rape area. But what's the condition of that crop looking like at the moment?
Very variable in short form. The slightly longer answer would be to say it really does depend on where you are in the country and what you faced. I think that there's definitely been some localised cabbage stem flea beetle damage. More we're picking up from a larvae perspective than an adult perspective coming through, but there's been some quite widespread reports of pigeon damage as well over the winter, and some more localised deer grazing as well, impacting those crops. So that probably does flip the story a little bit compared to the winter cereals, which are in better condition than we reported on in the autumn. For winter oilseed rape, nationwide, there's less in a good to excellent condition than there was before the winter. We're still looking better than 12 months ago, but that was, again, particularly poor after all that horrendous weather that impacted the crops. But yeah, not quite as rosy. For individual crops, there's still good potential, but it just depends on how much pressure they've taken from pests over the winter.
Not that the winter weather doesn't matter for crops in terms of their development. The winter weather is all about actually getting them in the ground, getting them established and just physically there to then develop through the spring. But there's a point that from where we go through here from a developmental perspective, again, there's a bit of time now, but when you get into that key yield forming stage going through kind of second half of May all the way through flowering for wheat and other crops through June into early July, that's that kind of critical kind of 8-week period. And everything now is just making sure we get to the crop to that point in the best possible state. So whilst we're talking about the dry weather and the fact that it isn't particularly favourable for crop development for where we want it to be now, in terms of, it isn't the ideal weather for now. A bit of rain would be good. It isn't the end of the world. There is still time whilst we're kind of we're not on that homeward bound stretch into harvest at the moment. There's still a bit of time that we've got to play with. So let's not panic, but it's something we need to keep an eye on, isn't it? Definitely. Right. Thank you, Helen. We're going to go to our break now where we're going to get the latest in the markets. And when we come back, me and Helen are going to be talking about this year's planting and variety survey, what it is, why it's important, and how we're doing it slightly differently this year.
Hi, I'm Olivia Bonser, Senior Analyst at AHDB, with a look at grain and oilseed markets for the week commencing the 31st of March. Domestic feed wheat prices have continued to fall over the last few weeks, with May 25 futures falling to a contract low last Friday. UK prices follow global markets down on the back of updates surrounding the war in Ukraine, favourable weather forecasts and weak global export demand. Ongoing talks brokered by the US for a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine are impacting market direction at the moment. Beneficial rain is expected in the US, Russia and Eastern Europe. Following a dry period, this is expected to ease concerns over winter crops and improve the 2025 harvest outlook, adding further bearish sentiment. Paris rapeseed futures, however, have been well supported over the last couple of weeks. This was mainly driven by limited supply in the EU and bullish sentiment in Canadian canola futures. As Northern Hemisphere crops enter their key development stage over the coming weeks, conditions in key producing regions will remain in focus. Any updates on relations in the Black Sea and the impact on exports will also be a key driver. To stay up to date with the latest data and analysis across arable, red meat and dairy markets, head to hdb.org.uk and click on Markets and Prices.
AHDB's Planting and Variety Survey delivers UK planted area estimates for the upcoming harvest each year. The results offer an early idea of what might be available for the upcoming UK cereals and oilseed rape harvest, and this year will reflect the impact of what was a challenging autumn for many. But we can only do this with your help. If you're a UK grower, please take a moment to complete the crop and variety form for Harvest 2025. You may have received the survey through the post, in which case please complete and return it by Monday the 12th of May. Alternatively, you can fill in a form online. Just go to ahdb.org.uk/PVS25 and ensure it's submitted by Friday the 16th of May. The survey is open now and the results will be available on the AHDB website from the 10th of June. Thank you for your input.
Welcome back to part 2 of Agronomics. And if you're sitting there thinking, I don't know what the area of wheat is this year, what is the area of spring barley that's been planted? How am I going to understand what's in the ground and what the potential production can be, and therefore how I should market my grain? Worry no further. Like a bridge over troubled water, we're here with our annual planting and variety survey. And this year, we're doing things slightly differently with our timing. Our senior analyst Helen Plant is with me still, and we've spoken about crop conditions. But Helen, let's talk about the planting and variety survey. So it's opened this week, Monday the 7th of April, the data entry system opened. But do you want to just explain, I suppose, what it is, why we do it, and what is different about it this year?
So let's start with the end, and it gives us the first sort of post-planting estimate of what crops are in the ground for the coming harvest. I say us, I mean the royal us sort of thing, the whole industry, growers, government, everyone alike. It is supported by you guys listening. So we ask growers very kindly to fill in a form for us, either a paper form, which should be landing with or in the post over the weekend or arriving very soon, or an online form as well. We simply ask about what you harvested last year, what was the area, and what is the area of the crop for this year. And what we do is for everyone, we add up those totals, work out the percentage difference, and use that difference to then come up with an estimate of the cropped areas. So if everyone in the country said 5% more wheat, we'll add 5% to last year's DEFRA area, and that will give it how we work out our estimate. The survey also asks about what varieties people have planted for this coming year, so we can work out roughly what sort of percentage of things are, say, suitable for malting, or by UK flour miller grouping as well.
I've heard a rumour, Helen, and when I say I've heard a rumour, you can blame me because I think it was my idea, so it might be my fault, that actually we're going to be doing this slightly earlier than we normally would, aren't we? If we're going to be delivering the results of this survey at the cereals event, which would be almost about a month earlier than we normally would.
Yeah, absolutely. We normally aim for sort of early to mid-July, depending on how the dates fall and that sort of thing. I think the previous earliest we've delivered is sort of like the 4th of July, maybe. So yeah, aiming for cereals would be nearly a month earlier than we have in the past. So the main bit we've done there is we are still asking for people to input right through the planting window and up until the 12th of May if you're posting us a paper form, and till the 16th of May if you're willing to do it online. So you've got an extra few days there. And we've sort of worked out a way to condense how we process our data, working with new technology and things to get it out earlier than we have in the past.
The big reason for doing it really was just, we've got a big event that we can go and present it at, which is always going to be fantastic. And I think, you and Team Helen are going to be there at Cereals presenting the results of this, which is going to be great, direct to levy payers. But it's also, I think, timeliness of information. And, we've seen the volatility in crop production change quite dramatically over recent years, again, because of weather events. We're here talking about dry weather now. What if we have dry weather that continues all the way through, and there's real concerns about crop production and about crop quality as well, because that's a significant thing. We were talking at the start of the show about the volatility that external events create, and the tariffs is a way around that. And obviously from tariffs being put in place by America all the way through to domestic crop production seems a bit of a kind of leap, but it is because, again, we're part of that big global market, that if there is tariffs that's put on rice, maize, whatever it would be, that has a natural knock through onto our domestic market. And if we're then in a position where we're needing to import more because the weather has been poor and the quality isn't as good, and therefore we have a greater reliance on the world market, if there's volatility in that world market, it's better for everyone in the system to know how much is likely to be produced, and therefore the amount we would need, and therefore the exposure that we have to the global market with that greater volatility. So all of this is purely just around trying to provide more responsive information so that levy payers are able to get that information earlier to be able to inform their business decisions. So it is probably a bit of a pain in the backside that we may have created for internal teams in kind of getting it done quicker, but we think there's going to be a huge amount of volume of value in doing so. But the critical thing, as Helen said, is that we need levy payers and farmers to be able to input their data so that we can all get a better understanding of what's in the ground. That's the critical thing with the survey, isn't it?
It is, yeah, and that support is so much appreciated with people who do this. It really does help everyone, not just yourselves that coming through. Because I was thinking when you were talking then about what level of imports we require, and actually if we've got on better as well than we thought we might have done, do we need as much imports as this season? We might need to import less, and having that earlier knowledge as well is always good from a sort of balancing point of view. And then actually from a more practical on-farm point of view, if we're getting the information to you in June, that might still be in time to think about what crops for the following year, if you wanted to adjust not just your selling pattern for the 25 crop, but about what planting rotations you might be thinking about for 26 as well.
There's a huge amount of value to this type of information, and any data and good data and more data is a better thing and allows people to make decisions and make more informed decisions, which is what we're all about. So all of this is about trying to provide data. So as Helen said, please do, if you're able to fill in the forms, fill in the survey online and send them back to us so that we can create that bigger picture. It would be hugely valuable for the industry.
And you can find links to where the survey is and our frequently asked questions as well. So if you've got any queries or thoughts about it, they'll all be in the show notes, so you can find the link there.
Now, thank you, Helen, for your input today. And I'm sure that those that are listening are wondering, who was that mystery musical act that we sewed through all the way through that conversation? And there's a few which I think were probably very, very subtle. There's a few which were blindingly obvious. If you didn't get Bridge Over Troubled Water, shame on you for not knowing Simon and Garfunkel. Where have you been for the last 50 years? But it was Simon and Garfunkel, and they're great. I really like the pictures of Simon and Garfunkel in their early LPs where they've got those like massive big curly hair. That's what I think of when I think of Simon and Garfunkel. Maybe I'm just jealous of their hair. Anyway, that's another story.